You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and we're glad you tuned in. I'd like to remind you of the value of leaving reviews on places like iTunes or wherever you're listening, as well as the value of sharing us with your various networks. It's a real pleasure for me to host most of the TeachThought podcast episodes and get to bring you thoughtful and interesting guests. And as our audience grows, so does the quality and the quantity of guests that are available to us. So we do encourage you and would appreciate any of those reviews, shares, and things like that to help us grow our audience. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to reach out to me via email at drew@teachthought.com. If you have stumbled upon us but are not familiar with our work in other areas, just a few notes that we do directly work with schools, leaders, and teachers to help them grow to better prepare learners for what we call the modern world by building upon the ethos of TeachThought.com. So I invite you to visit our professional development website, wegrowteachers.com, where you'll find information on the variety of workshops, consulting services, and events that we offer to help you grow in areas like project-based learning and inquiry, differentiated instruction, assessment, literacy, growth mindset, leadership, and much more. So I invite you again to contact us today to explore how we can help design and deliver professional learning that provokes profound thinking driven by your beautiful questions. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Ron Ritchhart, who is the Principal Investigator at the Cultures of Thinking Project, a Senior Research Associate at Project Zero, the Harvard Grad School of Education, as well as an author of several books, and we talked mostly about his work as an author, especially his most recent book, which was from 2015, Creating Cultures of Thinking, the 8 Forces We Must Master to Truly Transform Our Schools. I have been trying to get Ron on the podcast for some time now. From some scheduling issues, it took a little bit more time to get him on, but I'm glad I did. We talked about the concept of intellectual character, thinking about critical thinking, metacognition, the differences and the similarities between knowledge and understanding and the role that plays in teaching and learning, and kind of tried to unpack the idea of great teaching as well as some of the pieces of his 8 forces. So I really enjoyed the podcast. I really enjoy his work. I apologize for a couple glitches and sound drops in the recording when we connect over the internet. Sometimes that happens. I think you'll be able to get the gist of what he's saying, though. So without further ado, I bring you Ron Ritchhart, and I hope you find it meaningful and enjoyable. I am here today with Ron Ritchhart, who I've been trying to track down for a few years since I read his, I think, most recent book, Creating Cultures of Thinking, from 2015, and I finally nailed it, and even though we dodged each other with all kinds of scheduling conflicts, I'm glad to have you on, and I'd like to give you, as I usually do, the opportunity to give our listeners who may not be as familiar with your background a little bit more information about your work and how you got to where you are, and then we can kind of get into the work that you're doing.
Okay, thanks, Drew. So I've been a researcher at Project Zero, which is part of the Graduate School of Education at Harvard, for the past 25 years. And before that was a classroom teacher, teaching both at the elementary level and then at the middle school level, teaching mathematics. And when I first came to Harvard, I was really attracted to the work of David Perkins, the work on teaching for understanding, the work around metacognition, and the idea of kind of developing thinkers. And so that work has just kind of grown. And I got my doctorate there at Harvard, and then the key bit of research that I did that has been kind of the foundation for all of my work going forward was I spent a year in classrooms where teachers were really adept at getting students to think. in terms of developing their habits of mind, developing their thinking dispositions, and really studying what those teachers did. And it's there where kind of the framework that I have for understanding how culture is built emerged, because the idea of cultivating students' dispositions to think isn't something that we teach directly, but it's more something that we enculturate. And so throughout all of my research, I've always focused on learning from best practice, seeing how teachers who are adept at getting students to think things that they do, and developing tools and resources to help schools, to help teachers, to help educators in lots of other fields as well, to focus on thinking and build that culture of thinking.
And what was your, if you don't mind sharing, your doctoral thesis? What kind of got you started with that?
Well, my doctoral thesis was intellectual character. So that became the book Intellectual Character, which was published in 2000. And so, again, that's where I kind of document and kind of captured what it was that these teachers did that was so effective in terms of developing kind of students' dispositions.
Okay. And if you go to your website, which is for those folks who want to learn a bit more, and you're certainly easily Googleable, but Ron Ritchhart with 2h's.com, it is interesting that you have lots of places that you're associated with, and one of those is Melbourne, and using the language of visible thinking, as you and I talked before we hit record here. I think it's important, because I was not clear, and I'm guessing lots of folks are not, that you are not directly associated with, even though you have some work in Melbourne, as does John Hattie, the visible thinking. Kind of clarify the differences there, if you would, before we get any further.
Sure. So, I mean, John Hattie and I are both associated, as you mentioned, from the University of Melbourne. But his work, which he titled Visible Learning, does create a little bit of kind of confusion. The work that we've done on visible thinking kind of predated his publication, and my colleagues work with the Reggio Emilia preschools, which focus on making learning visible, also predated kind of Hattie's publications. So to kind of understand and the difference, I do think that a key difference that people sometimes don't recognize is that Hattie is a statistician. And so the research that he does is pulling on other people's research and kind of synthesizing that. Mm-hmm. I do think that the title Visible Learning is a bit misleading, because I would say that he actually does not make learning in any way visible. That what he focuses on is teaching practices, and he tries through his research to illuminate effective teaching practices. So if he's made anything visible, it's effective teaching practices. But when it comes to learning, Hattie takes as a given that learning is performance on tests. And so all of the research, when it's about that he views something as being effective, and he uses effect sizes, and he's got his meters there to kind of judge effectiveness, the outcome is always performance on test scores. Well, I think that any educator would know that test scores actually obscure a lot of learning that students have done. Mm-hmm. That they don't give us a real window into how students are making sense of ideas, to how they're thinking about new ideas, to how they are putting things together in their mind. Often partial understandings on a test can result in a wrong answer, which gives you a 0 score, which means no learning, no understanding. And again, we know that that's not true. So, to at the outset have learning predetermined as test scores really is not making learning visible. Again, the focus there is on teaching practices.
Interesting. And we would agree here in our work, we really try to minimize or try to work around, and I really think that that's sort of an elephant in the room, those test scores and that accountability piece, and the validity and reliability of those, I think, are certainly easy to question and important to question. I just recently, I have a 9 and 11-year-old daughters, and one of my daughters was not qualified for gifted and talented going forward because of some scores that she received in literacy and reading and things like that, but then a different set of scores which qualified her or labeled her as distinguished in reading and literacy. So something is amiss here, and as teachers try to work through that, I sometimes argue or debate or discuss with policymakers or folks in that realm of how important and unfortunately important that role of test scores and accountability, how that affects the way that teachers actually teach versus how they think they should teach, perhaps. And I'm much more of a fan of the metacognition and the deeper thinking and the understanding. And that idea of intellectual character really grabs my attention. So what can you unpack that a little bit? Because that's just a really rich term.
Yeah, so intellectual character is a way of kind of reconceptualizing intelligence. We often think about intelligence as being these fixed abilities that people have. Maybe they are abilities that are somewhat kind of growable, and we develop those. The idea of intellectual character, though, says that what if we looked at intelligence as a characterological development? And so a set of dispositions, because character is made up of the various dispositions we have. And if we cultivated those dispositions, then we would be cultivating a student's intellectual character. So, and character is actually, when we think about character, we don't sit people down and give them a test to determine their character. We recognize character through their actions in the world. And so by the same token, the idea of intellectual character is saying, well, what good is it really to sit people down and give them, a test and say, oh, you have this kind of innate ability in terms of your intelligence, when what's really counts is how we perform in the world, the dispositions, the things which kind of motivate us and carry forward. And so, we wouldn't sit someone down and say, oh, you're a very curious person. Too bad you just aren't curious. So we look at curiosity as, the person demonstrates curiosity. They do things which, show that they are curious. So a dispositional approach, and hence a characterological approach, is always about action. And so it's having that focus on, who are our students becoming as thinkers and learners, rather than focusing on innate ability.
So does that get into the role or the differences? I know you've done some work around sort of differentiating the idea of knowledge and understanding, and that's one of the things I've been exploring recently, is the importance of knowledge in teaching and learning, and some of the pushback that more traditional folks might say that more progressive teaching is missing out on, that we're not teaching really important knowledge, which I would disagree with, because I think we need to be teaching knowledge, and there is a really important role there. But how does that play out in your thinking, the knowledge and understanding and the differences and the importance of those things?
Yeah, so the very first research project that I worked on when I came to Harvard was the Teaching for Understanding project. And that project was funded by the Spencer Foundation precisely because they recognized that we don't really have a research base around understanding. A lot of the research in education is about the teaching of knowledge and skills. Again, back to kind of Hattie's research, a lot of it really is around the teaching of knowledge and skills. And so we really focused on trying to understand, well, what is involved in developing kind of understanding. So that's been a very long tradition that kind of permeates everyone at Project Zero's work, this kind of focus on understanding. Now, a lot of people, we do want to make that distinction, say, between knowledge and understanding, but we also don't want to draw a false dichotomy between the two, that it's one or the other. And in fact, to teach for understanding, you recognize that is knowledge involved. You can't neglect knowledge and teach for understanding, but there's a focus on connected knowledge. There's a focus on the ability to use and apply one's skills and one's knowledge. Another, somewhat kind of easy kind of contrast that I sometimes give to people is, you can quite easily think of many, many times when you've gotten new knowledge without asking a single question. You can listen to something, you can read something, you can see something, and get that kind of new knowledge. And so in that sense, knowledge can be acquired in somewhat of a passive sense at times, at least. But you can't say the same thing of understanding. With understanding, you've got to be asking questions, because understanding is a very, very personal construction. You have to connect the ideas to things you already know. You kind of have to focus on kind of moving that forward, on kind of building explanations and building interpretations and theories around those ideas. And also we recognize that understanding is not a surface endeavor. It is an in-depth endeavor. So in no way does a focus on understanding neglect knowledge, because again, you've got to have that. But it's just saying that our goal is much bigger and deeper and broader than just having the knowledge. We want students to be able to use, to apply, to connect, and take that kind of forward into the ability.
So that sort of old saying of knowledge is power, which I kind of push back on and say it certainly can be helpful, but understanding is more powerful. And of course, as you said, the knowledge is integral in that. I wonder if you react to that statement differently. And one of the things that I hear from more traditional teachers and maybe even some sort of middle of the road is that, and we do lots of work in project-based learning, they want to front load and really, they say, well, they can't ask questions without knowledge. And if they don't understand, or if they don't know anything about something, they can't ask great questions, which I agree with in some sense, but there's a sense of unpacking and identifying that knowledge as through that process of inquiry. So getting to the understanding, as you mentioned, is really the inquiry is the tool through which we get there. So, to me, the idea that you would front load any of that sort of learning with knowledge first, it seems counterintuitive to me, but not to lots of teachers. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's a lot there to unpack. So you may have to help me kind of cycle back. So I'm starting with the end there first. Mm-hmm. So, I think perhaps one of the things that teachers might perhaps missing, the ones that you're kind of describing in terms of front loading, is that we have to only focus on the questions that students ask at the beginning of an inquiry. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of an inquiry, we might set up a situation that is quite experiential, that begins to kind of get them into a topic, and beginning to ask questions. And certainly as we move forward, we are constantly bringing in, experience, knowledge, and then new questions emerge. And so to my mind, an inquiry should be an evolving process, not something that we ask our questions at the beginning, so those are the ones that we'll answer and then we'll solve. But
sure.
Those are beginning questions, and we evolve and move forward. And in fact, that evolving nature of questions is also just one of the natural kind of hallmarks of understanding. When you ask adults, to name something that they understand really well, a lot of adults will struggle with that, precisely because the more that we understand about a topic, the more we realize there's things we don't know, the more questions that we have. And so we also want to give students that opportunity to continue and evolve those questions, rather than thinking an inquiry kind of begins with a set of questions and they should never kind of change. You also mentioned kind of the idea that, that knowledge is power. And it certainly is true that a lot of, the terms get used kind of very loosely. So in terms of, when someone might talk deeply about, that idea of, what real knowledge is, which I think would actually push towards, understanding. A quote that I like from Tony Wagner is, that relates what kind of turns that a little bit around is, he says, the world will not pay you for what you know. The world will only pay you for what you can do with what you know. Mm-hmm. So there is kind of clearly around the application. If knowledge were power, well, Wikipedia has a lot of knowledge. But is Wikipedia powerful? No, because it can't act of its own volition. It can't do anything with that. So it's our ability to use, to apply, to take that forward. So again, all of those are the qualities that we begin to kind of recognize around understanding. So again, you can't create this false dichotomy that knowledge is only one thing and then there's understanding. Knowledge is a part of understanding. And so I would say that the power of knowledge arises when we understand.
Yeah, and in a podcast that I had done with her name's Catherine Burbelsing, and she and I kind of really dived into this, and she said you can't be curious about something you don't know much about, and I said that doesn't seem at all accurate. I mean, I'm tremendously curious as I look out into space, and there's so little I know about that. And then she kind of came back and said, well, but you wouldn't be able to ask great questions. But as you mentioned, and I totally agree, that I wouldn't have tremendously rich questions perhaps at the beginning, but as I learned more, I would, if somebody, as a teacher, a great teacher would do, you would sort of unpack and have more rich questions because you're learning more, and that begets more questions. And it just it really struck me as a very odd way to think about learning, and thinking that you can't be creative with something unless you have mastered it, and that doesn't seem accurate to me at all either. So it really troubles me that we have so many teachers and educators that might think that way, as opposed to really getting at this metacognition and the deeper thinking and using the inquiry pieces.
Yeah, I agree with you that's I think that sometimes, as a profession, we are very, used to, we've been given lots of curriculum documents, we've given a lot of information, and so we've traditionally thought about teaching as kind of that delivery of content, and we need to kind of get that content across. And I think what Problembased Learning, what inquiry does, is it tries to set up the conditions in which students will be more interested in that knowledge and content, and hence then they'll be able to integrate it. And that's something that we know from curiosity and that need to know, then the knowledge sticks better. And so the notion of, I'll just front load this without giving something for that knowledge to stick to, I don't think is very effective.
Yeah. So the most recent book that you have, and I know you're working on a second edition of your Making Thinking Visible book into the second volume, but the most recent one, which is Creating Cultures of Thinking, is the one that I'm most familiar with, and I really found it interesting how you framed this, and you talk about the forces that shape culture. They are eight pieces, so expectations, language, time, modeling, opportunities, routines, and interactions, and environment. So what was the process of coming up with those 8? How did you narrow it to those 8?
So these came originally from that research that I did for the book Intellectual Character, from those study of classrooms where the teachers were really adept at getting students to think. So in that analysis of kind of what were they doing and how were they, trying to understand their teaching practice, trying to understand kind of this process of enculturation, trying to understand what kinds of things, that they were leveraging. And so that was kind of looking below the surface level of, say, just the instructional practices, just, the bits of a lesson that people are doing, because, culture is something that kind of permeates that, so that we are attending to it in a much more kind of integrated way. So those emerged from that analysis. And in terms of, lots of observations in classrooms, lots of video of teaching, and lots of kind of breaking that down and beginning to kind of analyze kind of the subtleties of things that were going on. And I called these forces because, just like the force of gravity isn't something that we make decisions about. We don't wake up in the morning and decide we would like gravity today or not. These forces then are not something that a teacher has to implement, that these are present in every group, every organization, every classroom, every school. So that was a big criteria right there. So they couldn't be something that someone merely, this teacher kind of added this, and it doesn't have to be there. So if you look at, again, any group that you're a part of, all of these 8 things would be there. So that was, one of those kind of main overriding criteria. So, a big thing that I saw these teachers do was, rather than teaching a thinking skills lesson, what I noticed was they had routines and structures which they leveraged over and over again, that were woven into their classroom. Well, the idea of routines, every group has routines. A routine can be thought of as, this is how we do things here. And so as soon as you join a new group, you pay attention to, well, how do they do things here? How do they hold meetings? How do they have conversations? How do they, have disagreements? All of those are kind of routines and structures. And so those are present. Now, it's true that you can be in groups where the routines are not effective, and when the routines are counterproductive. All of those can be true as well, but there are still routines that have to kind of be used. So that means also, when teachers kind of look at this, one of the challenges is, as a profession, we are very used to, whenever we receive any kind of professional development work, whenever new ideas come in, we're very used to the idea of implementing something. We want kind of this new idea, and how do I implement this? As if it's a new program, it's a new thing to do. Well, since the 8 cultural forces are already there, there's nothing to implement. Instead, what you have to do is you have to examine very closely what it is you're doing. You have to look at your own practice, and then you have to kind of move that forward and recognize what things you're doing which may be effective, which may be ineffective, what are the messages which are being sent from your practices. And so, although we do have with each of these 8 cultural forces a whole variety of tools and practices that facilitate a culture of thinking, it's not merely a process of implementation. It's a co-process of reflection, examination, and then kind of moving forward in a direction that helps to really support students as thinkers and learners.
Mm-hmm. Is the expectations part, how closely related is that to the growth mindset work?
Well, I'm actually, so in the book, Cultures of Thinking, I identified kind of some really key expectational elements that really kind of are foundational to the idea of building a culture. And the idea of a growth mindset was one of the ones that we identified, that teachers have to have that idea. If you are going to develop intellectual character, if you are going to develop students as thinkers, that you have to have that notion that intelligence is something that we grow and we develop. And so that was actually one of the core expectations, as was the idea of focusing on understanding versus knowledge, and also focusing and using kind of deep structures, deep learning versus surface learning.
The piece about time really strikes me as well, and I had just recorded a podcast with Michael Hines. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He's a superintendent in Long Island, New York, but he had just returned from Finland, and one of the things that he noted was that teachers there teach like 20 hours a week, which is a little bit different than the way you talk about time in the book, more about wait time and processing time, which is really valuable and is unfortunately not something that happens in classrooms enough. Teachers seem to be in such a rush, but part of that is, I think, because there's so much that we're supposedly supposed to cover and really get through. I'm a big fan of paring that down and going more deep and slow, because that time really is it's such a precious resource. So is there an ideal, or what do you think about sort of that 20 hours and or less content in our curriculums?
Well, one of the things that we are learning more and more about, and just in terms of how kind of the brain works and kind of the process of learning, is that we do need to have downtime. We need to have time to disconnect. That's actually a lot of very important learning happens for students during that time. A lot of important social emotional learning, but also they've been showing that downtime is a chance where our minds are not just unplugging, but our minds are actually becoming more creative. Our minds are actually forming lots of connections. It gets us ready to learn. So we've often thought, in America, in terms of time, in terms of inefficiency, and we need to, book up all of this time because we have in our brains, from our design of school, a very kind of factory model view of things and a very efficiency thing. So, we think that if we turn the assembly line off, then nothing's happening. So we've got to kind of keep kids on that assembly line. But of course now, as I say, and as we understand more about how the brain works and what that downtime allows and the learning that does happen during that time, we are beginning to kind of reconceptualize time. And, Finland is kind of, been a leader, for many years in terms of, drawing on very sound research in terms of how people do actually learn, how the brain actually works, thinking about developing, the whole child and developing that kind of, dispositional approach. So, for them to kind of take the lead makes a lot of sense in that. I think it's very difficult in America for schools to kind of make those time changes. Very, well-known and very, very long researched, finding is that the adolescent brain doesn't really, is on a very different sleep cycle from that of younger child and that of an adult. And in fact, they really aren't ready to start learning until around 9 o'clock, or even slightly after that. And yet, we've got high schools which still start at 7:30.
Right.
And, we've known this for ages. And yet, we don't have the political will to do it because we're dictated by the bus schedule. And we're dictated by sports. So we need to, have time after school for sports practice and do that. So we allow lots of other things in America to interfere with what we know about learning.
Right. And circling back to the knowledge piece, one of the things that we see a lot sort of on social media and progressive, innovative educators is this idea that we don't know what jobs and what the future will look like, and I certainly agree with that. So the idea that we have these curriculum pieces and these sets of knowledge and these loads of content that our students are supposed to master, which I kind of jokingly say in workshops, like, what teacher has ever had a student leave their classroom as a master of all of the content that they're supposed to? Heck, I mean, teachers often don't have that, and I'm not necessarily sure that they should know all of the content. I taught AP psychology, and I would always start the class by saying, look, I don't know everything about this, and that's really not my job here. It's really more to get you thinking and get to that understanding piece. But how do you maybe suggest, if you have some suggestions for schools in navigating curriculum pieces and content pieces that are going to be preparing students for what we like to call the modern world?
Well, I guess one piece of advice I would have, and I think it relates to I think a mistake sometimes, again, that we make as teachers, that when we're given these curriculum documents and we're given the standards, because of the way that they're laid out, the way that they're presented, we think that all of those things are equal. And we then teach them as if all of them are equal. And in fact, they aren't. And so what that means is that we as teachers need to kind of look at our curriculum documents, look at our syllabi for the courses we're teaching, and identify, well, what are the key understandings that students really need? What are the foundational things that will really take them forward? So if I spend time on this and we really develop our understanding around this, this will serve students well. And then we make sure that we really do give that time to understanding, those, 3 or 4 things, rather than just teaching it as another bit of curriculum. And then some of the things which are less important. If we have those foundational understandings, then, if you think about those, if you've got 3 or 4 of those, and those are 3 or 4 magnets to which some of this other kind of knowledge and content can then be attracted to and connected with. But we shouldn't teach everything as if it's all equal. And that then, I think, helps us to think about how is it that we will allocate, the time in our courses. What will we give time for? And we need to give time for those kind of foundational pieces which will set students up well for future learning.
Right. So one of the things that you note in some of your work, or I saw the term great teachers, which really is an interesting term. I'm wondering if what are some of those dispositions and characteristics, and how we might think about, qualifying what is a great teacher? What is that like in your thinking?
Well, so a lot of the research that I've done, as I said, it really kind of draws on best practice. So these teachers I studied, I had a whole process for identifying those teachers, from, community members, saying, here are people that they know really develop them, from administrators going in, interviewing teachers, observing them. I had another big project with the Disney Foundation, which used to sponsor the American Teacher Awards. So those were teachers who were, identified across the nation as being kind of innovative and creative teachers, whose students, excelled. And so I've often worked with these teachers who, have been identified or labeled in some ways as kind of highly effective, creative, innovative. One of the qualities that I, always see that I would say is across the board of a great teacher is great teachers are never satisfied. So I've never met a great teacher that's complacent. They may be doing amazing things in their classrooms, and yet they're still looking about how can they do that better? How might I reach more students? How can I up this? So that idea of not being satisfied, of not being complacent, is to me one of the real hallmarks of a great teacher. And that doesn't mean that, then you aren't still, you can certainly be a great teacher and struggle and have things that aren't effective, but you're not letting that define your practice. You're letting that motivate your practice. And so I would name that as kind of, the number one quality. I think another thing that I see is there's this genuine interest in their students and in the process of learning. So great teachers are not merely kind of masters of their content who will then, deliver their content, but they are really interested in their students. They're interested in how they are making sense of ideas. They ask questions then out of that motivation because they are interested in understanding their students' learning. So again, that's a prime motivation. And so, and that's something that, a beginning teacher can have, as well as a very experienced teacher. So those would be 2 qualities that I really recognize.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is really vital in great teaching is sort of having that high processor speed. And so being able to really be reactive in some sense, and sometimes I talk about it in terms of the art and science of teaching, and when we're working with teachers thinking about the science, and let's really be sharp and smart about the architecture of our lessons and design of units or projects if we're doing project-based learning, so that we have all of those things as well as sort of content understanding and fluency as a teacher sort of down and ready to go. That then allows for that sort of art of teaching, knowing when to push, when to ask those questions, when to pull back, and some of those things. So with that in mind, it one of the things that I have wondered about recently, be curious your thoughts on this, is sort of are there sort of strata of teachers, and are there some teachers that are likely to struggle for whatever reason, whether it's experience or lack of content understanding or something like that, to really struggle to do some of those great art of teaching, have sort of facilitate for some of those moments, then, and I'm not a big fan of sort of canned curriculum and scripted stuff by any stretch of the imagination, but I sometimes wonder is any of that helpful for some of those teachers who lack the experience, lack the content understanding, or some of those other characteristics. Does that make any sense, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, everyone would recognize from their own experience that, we grow as teachers. We do a lot of learning kind of in those first, 5 years as a teacher. There's a lot of, some of the logistics and fine points of teaching that we begin to kind of pick up and refine. And so, what I worried about that when we give teachers, scripts or predetermined curriculum, as if that someone can kind of teach that without understanding the actual material themselves, that we aren't really improving teaching at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And that rather than thinking that those are bootstraps that someone can kind of pull themselves up by, I think that they actually may kind of lower the performance in the long run, because effectively what they're doing is de-skilling teachers, is saying that you don't really need to kind of know this. So I think that's where we come in, and we really have to kind of create really rich professional learning cultures in which teachers can support one another to grow and develop.
Yeah, I mentioned that question, and some people think it's a really dangerous question, and I understand why. And my intent certainly is not to demean anybody, but I think it's a reality that we have some teachers that are better than others, and that's natural. One of the suggestions, and I liked, was sort of team teaching and sort of apprentice mentor kind of approach, where you might have a less experienced, less effective teacher working side by side with somebody who is more effective, and using that as a learning opportunity where they might not be doing as much direct teaching perhaps as the more experienced teacher, but there's time for that reflection and processing, and with the ideal of growth, which I like that idea. And I'm curious what you think about as far as how we increase the quality of teachers. One of the things that I really like is teachers giving each other feedback and sort of holding each other accountable. And again, referring back to Finland, apparently that is something that they do quite a bit. I think that's a really powerful thing that we miss in our schools. That idea that an administrator's coming in and giving you sort of the criteria, the checklist, the feedback, whatever. It certainly, that can have some power, but there's such a limited opportunity there that we're missing when teachers are talking about each other's work, giving each other feedback, holding each other accountable, and pushing one another. Is there a model or some great examples that you've seen of teachers improving their work through collaboration and dialogue?
Well, I think that we often throw new teachers kind of into the deep end of the pool without a lot of support. And if we think about what's done in medicine, where there's actually a residency, that a model like that in which there is an initial couple of years in which new teachers are working with experienced teachers and learning from them and learning with them would be much more effective than just expecting that right out of university with a few weeks of student teaching, a teacher can kind of go into that role. So I think we could certainly improve teaching if we had a much more supportive and introductory couple of years really for teachers to do that kind of collaboration with a more experienced teacher and with a mentor teacher. And certainly if we kind of get teachers across the board of all levels into one another's classrooms, into more kind of discussion about the teaching and learning that is going on, that goes a long way too.
Yeah, so I'm mindful of your time here. Let's talk a little bit about the updates or the work, the Making Thinking Visible work, and where that's going. I know you said you've got a second volume you're working on, hopefully to come out next year. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so again, from these 8 cultural forces, that I mentioned briefly the idea of routines that we saw, these effective teachers of thinking actually leveraging routines and structures. So with my colleague David Perkins and Shari Tishman in a project we had in Sweden, we really took that idea of developing thinking routines, and that's where the idea of those routines, one of the things they were doing was they were helping to make students' thinking visible to us, so it gives us very useful information. It also helps them to think with ideas, to think with other people, and to begin that construction of meaning. So then we developed quite a number of routines. We wrote about that in the book, Making Thinking Visible. But we have found that those routines have been incredibly useful, and that these are not activities that teachers do with students. We think about routines as routines for learners, so we use them with adult learners in all kinds of situations. We use them ourselves when we're meeting. And so we continually have been developing new routines. These often emerge from learning situations that we're aware of, that we want to kind of move forward with. How might we kind of structure that? How might we scaffold and support that thinking? And so we've identified about 21 additional new routines. And we, with my colleague Mark Church and Veronica Boix-Mencia, we are working on the second volume of Making Thinking Visible.
Okay, great. So is there one final question before I want to get you to list any place that folks would find you, or I'm not sure if you're doing much social media, but all of those things, and before we wrap up, but a resource, a book, an idea, a person, somebody that, or something that folks may not have heard about or know about, or something that maybe has been really profound that you would suggest outside of your own work for teachers to think about and learn more about the craft of teaching in general?
Well, one bit of research I think that connects to some things that we've kind of hit on here by my colleague Ben Mardell and Mara Krzyzewski, working with the Lego Foundation. They have a new project called The Pedagogy of Play, and really taking the idea of play seriously, that children learn from play. And I've been very interested in kind of following the research that they've done. So it's just, I think it's in its about its second year at this point. So there's not a lot of things that are published yet on it, but they've developed some really kind of interesting insights and ideas, and how we then as teachers can use some of the things that we learn about play and the value of play and integrate that into all kinds of learning situations. So I think that's something for people to kind of put on their radar and continually to look at in the future.
Interesting. I'll have to look that up, and we'll make sure if we have some links to add that to the show notes. So speaking of other links and places, I know you have a website, Ron Ritchhart, with, again, 2H's.com. Any other places, social media, places that you suggest folks might learn more about your work or connect with you?
Well, connecting with me through Twitter at Ron Ritchhart. Again, 2H's. And the book, Making Thinking Visible, has its own Facebook page. Again, just on Facebook, Making Thinking Visible. We've got about 40,000 people on there. People often kind of share and post ideas around the use of thinking routines and about the promotion of thinking more generally.
Okay. Well, again, his name is Ron Ritchhart. He is, among other things, the Senior Research Associate at Project Zero, the Harvard Grad School of Education, and a better or more interesting title maybe is the Principal Investigator of the Cultures of Thinking Project. So, Ron, I'm glad we could finally catch up. There's so much more I'm sure we could talk about at some point, but thanks for the work you're doing. It's important and helpful, and as I said, we use it in some of our workshops as well because it really does help people really connect and think more deeply about all kinds of things. So I appreciate that.
Great. Pleasure to talk with you, Drew.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.